Good morning all, and welcome today. On behalf of RIKK, the Institute for Gender Equality at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you to the first talk of the 2018 autumn term lecture series. The program is already out. It's here, and we will distribute it towards the end. The RIKK lecture series this fall is dedicated to women's revolution against harassment and violence, and the attending responses, research and activism in an endeavor to analyze the incentive, nature and consequences of the MeToo movement from different viewpoints. My name is Þorgerður Þorvaldsdóttir. I'm a gender studies scholar, work at not at the university but at the Reykjavík Academy. But I'm not here to introduce myself, but our speaker today, which is Giti Chandra, who is currently an affiliated scholar at UNU guest teaching at the University of Iceland. She has been an associated professor at the Department of English in St. Stephen from Stephen College in Delhi. And she has taught and been a fellow at Rutgers University, New Jersey, from where she did her doctoral work on women and violence. And she is the author of a book, Narrating Violence, Constructing Collective Identities to Witness These Wrongs Unspeakable. Chandra's talk today is on one of the more controversial aspects of the MeToo movement, the production of lists naming perpetrators. The people contributing to this list have often preferred to remain anonymous, and these unnamed people are seen as either weak or malicious, hiding behind their anonymity, can I say this word, in order to wage vendettas against named perpetrators, or as weak and faceless, defined by and forced and forever trapped in their victimhood. Contextualizing this discussion within trauma studies, the presentation will look at the implication of the anonymity for notions of agency and victimhood, and offer alternative, more inclusive feminist ways of thinking of anonymity and personhood. But the floor is your turn. Giti, welcome.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially today because this morning we got news that the Supreme Court of India has finally decriminalized gay sex. So it is now legal to be homosexual in India. Yes. So there is hope. There is hope after all. So I'm going to talk about the anonymous feminist, and I'll jump right in. I think, I don't know how many people here put up the MeToo hashtag, but if you did, or you knew someone who did, you saw that it was met almost always with uncritical sympathy. People sent little broken heart icons, they sent sympathy, they sent support, they said love. Nobody said, really? How do we know that you were really harassed? Who was it? Let us decide. None of that, nothing. It was uncritical, unconditional support. But you also had the other side of the MeToo movement, where you didn't name yourself, but you named your harasser. And there was, I don't know how many of you followed it, but there was in 2017 this list that came out called Shitty Media Men. It was meant to be a kind of whisper list where women could protect each other by pointing to certain people in media to say, stay away from this guy, don't go for dinner with this guy, don't sit next to this guy, this man has, etc., etc. But literally within hours of its private circulation, it went public as things on electronic media do. And of course, there was the usual set of responses to it, and I'll come to them in more detail in a minute. But there was this. Why have a list of victims when a list of perpetrators would be so much more useful? And one of the things I want to focus on today is this idea of naming. What do we gain from it? What do we not gain from it? What do we lose, actually, when we name ourselves? What do we lose when we don't name ourselves? And as it happens, we actually lose much more by being anonymous and naming our perpetrators, unfair as that may sound. And so this is Jessica Valenti's argument. She says that, of course, a list like this is not a solution to anything. It's not meant to be a solution. It's essentially guerrilla warfare. It is the only option left to people whom the system has failed. That you can ask them to go through due process, you can ask them to go to the courts, you can ask them to file cases, but the system has failed them, and therefore it's seen as a kind of triage, as guerrilla warfare. It's what the disenfranchised do when they have no other options. And according to her, she put out this thing, not victims, but monsters who need to be named and listed. I'm using a bunch of images that may not have anything to do with what's on the slide, but they're all taken from protests and other things, graffiti and so on, in my home university in Delhi. And I just, as homage to the people who have helped me think for the last many years. So I'm just putting up random pictures of protest there. So in India, last year there was a list also that came out. And it was in response to an article by Christine Fair that many of you may be familiar with, in which she, in Huffington Post, she names not only herself as the author and the protagonist of this article, but also each and every single person who harassed her at some point in her academic career. And there's a long list of men. And so in this case, you had a woman who did not remain anonymous, who named herself, who put herself out there in the public sphere, and then named each and every one of the men and gave details of their harassment of her. And then that list that article was taken down because of legal reasons, because HuffPost decided it couldn't run it, and for various other reactions to Christine Fair, it was taken down. And a young woman called Raya Sarkar, who is an Indian origin student at UC Davis, she crowdsourced a list. And she said that I will put my name there, but women or men or anybody else who have been harassed, discriminated against, assaulted, etc., were to give their stories to her. And she said, you give me your names, you give me the details, and I will put the names of the perpetrators up, and you will remain anonymous, although I will have your names should anyone really want them. And so, women contacted her in various ways, and the list went up as a Google Doc. It went up on Facebook. And within a couple of days, there were like 60 names on this list. And to our surprise, or maybe not so much, the majority of them were good feminist men, left-wing intellectuals, liberals, people who taught in very liberal institutions, very often people who taught about harassment, and so on. As you can imagine, there was a huge backlash and outcry to it. But she gave exactly the same reason as the shitty media men list. She said that it is primarily for students to be aware of which professors they need to avoid. So there were, of course, as you can imagine, responses across the board on this list. There were, on the one hand, people like Partho Chatterjee who said, as far as I'm aware, this has never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. If you give me the details, I will respond. Otherwise, take my name off the list. On the other end, there were other responders who said, who gave some version of this apology thing that we've all become so familiar with. If it happened, then I would like to say that I'm sorry if somebody's feelings were hurt. This very convoluted, knotted up, tangled version of response to an accusation. And so Abhijit Gupta said, for instance, that I invite my students to speak directly to me about any questions they may have. And the thing is that for women who have anonymously put names of harassers there, in which reality are they going to start discussing in person with someone who is an accused? The impracticality of that doesn't seem to have occurred to him. And then, of course, there are people like Benjamin Zachariah who said that there's no details, so therefore it is delegitimized. It's no longer a valid way to function. And very soon there came a letter that was published on a website called kafila.com, which is a feminist website set up by feminists, men and women, and run by a group of people whose work I have for a long time read, been part of, admired, respected. And they made what appears, I guess, on the surface to be an unimpeachable argument. They said, look, what you are doing is delegitimizes our work for decades, and we have worked very hard to make sure that there are legal processes available to people today in workplaces and in universities and so on. And what you are doing delegitimizes our struggle. And use the due process, use these institutions that we have spent so many years and actually a huge amount of personal sacrifice into setting up for you. And it's a very valid viewpoint, and as I say, it's unimpeachable in its own way. But if you look at the bits that I've highlighted, there were, of course, people who read this letter very differently. So when they began by saying, as feminists, it kind of gave the signal to say, we're feminists, we're not so sure exactly what you are. They would say, we are dismayed. And it was as if the older people are really annoyed. We are dismayed that you should do this. They said they're unsubstantiated accusations, so as to throw not suspicion, but at least to claim that who knows if you're telling the truth or not. And this is why it made me go back to the Me Too thing. No one ever said to me or to anyone else, how do we really know that you have a right to put up this hashtag? Nobody did that. So the idea of unsubstantiated accusations, anybody can be named anonymously, where there are genuine complaints, again implying that maybe your complaints are not genuine at all. They pointed them again to legal roads, to due process. They used again legal language to say you're delegitimizing us and our work. Again, it was our task as against how you are threatening our work. And then finally, they told them what to do. They said, withdraw it, take it back. And the larger feminist community will then welcome you into its arms. And so there was a whole way to read this letter which saw it as arch-patriarchy. You chuck the book at us, you tell us come forward, let us see your faces. You tell us we're dismayed, we're older, we're wiser. We don't know whether you're telling the truth or not. How do we know? Give us the details, etc., etc. And they saw this really as a shutting down of conversation altogether. And this was not, of course, peculiar to this particular incident. We've seen over the last year and a half at least how older feminists scold younger feminists. So, of course, there were the signatories to this letter. Remember Catherine Deneuve, who said, this is a puritanical witch hunt that is going on in France. Whoopi Goldberg, I was surprised. It's The View, not The Voice. I don't know why I've written The Voice. I'm probably preoccupied with having a voice. But the show is called The View. How can a man know if you don't say no? And she gave some version of, my mama said, if you don't want something to happen, you shouldn't go home with him after dinner. sort of, putting the blame back on the woman and doing this very older woman kind of older feminist scolding thing. Of course, the people on the other side, they saw this as a belittling of their cause, that you don't take us seriously, you're infantilizing us. There's all of this older people scolding, we're older and wiser, we know better, that their own methods were being delegitimized in return, that the Me Too movement was not inclusive enough to include their own particular kind of feminism, that the lists that they were making were being denounced without really being taken seriously. They were not being included in this movement, that they were being told, for instance, with the Aziz Ansari case, that it's just a bad date. Learn to deal with it. Be a man, grow up. This is what happens when you are a functioning adult, sexually, active. And so this divide sort of opened up in India, and of course, it's part of a divide that opened up everywhere. This is one of my more dear graffiti things. Remember, with power comes resistance. So here's some of the issues that I want us to be able to discuss today. Here's the Me Too movement. I name myself, I do not name my assaulters. Everyone believes me, everyone loves me. On the other hand, if you put up a list, I do not name myself, I name my assaulters. Nobody believes me, everybody hates me. And so what exactly is the function of anonymity? How does it work? How does it function? Why is it that this divide has opened up? How is it that we unconditionally believe someone who names themselves, even if we don't know who that person is, other than the name and maybe a profile picture? And on the other hand, there may be details of assault, there may be all manner of believable things, but if we don't have a name, we just don't believe them. We ascribe motivation to them, and so on. So one of the things I want to be able to do is to say, well, what next? Rather than get into this you and me, us and them, kind of binary. And we all know that when feminists fight, then the patriarchy laughs. We know that. The misogynist has a hearty laugh at the sight of fighting feminists. And so how to stop fighting and start, maybe looking at ways of bridging these divides. And I thought that one way to do it was just to come at it from different directions, not to be trapped in the kind of vocabulary or discourse that is presented to us, but maybe to start being more inclusive in the ways that we think about these issues. So one way to do it, of course, was to, in Delhi University, was just to spread awareness. To say, yes, we understand that due process is often not your answer. This was in the wake of a harassment case. It was actually a rape case that went to the High Court, where the judge actually said that sometimes a feeble no actually means yes. That was the judgment. And so given that kind of context, exactly how much faith are women supposed to have in this system? And one response to it was to go out there and just make that system available, tell people what their rights were, tell them what their options were, say this is how it's done, these are the laws, this is how what's mandated, this is what you have a right to. And so while the letter said men have a right to due process, you can't just name them, or harassers, as the case may be, since now we have Avital Ronald, who is not a man, and who's in this very high-profile case. Anybody accused has a right to due process, but also to bring that due process to everybody else, to explain it to them, to not live in your ivory tower and say, I've done my work, I've put it out there, now it's your turn, go and make use of it, but really to take it out there. So that was one option. The other thing I thought that we really must pay attention to is how we speak about things. I know this sounds very simplistic, and perhaps it's because I'm a literature person that it really, really, really bugs me. But language matters. How we talk about things dictates what we say and where the conversation goes. And so any one of these or more of these terms on the left popped up in response to lists around the world, not just the shitty media men list, but other lists, certainly the one in India. It was called a lynch list. Of course, feminazism is a term everyone hears everywhere, because really fighting for your rights is exactly like killing 6 million people. That's why we're feminazis. It was fascism, it was posse justice, it was vigilantism. And I think that no matter how scared you are, or how unfair you think it is, there is a material reality behind these terms. These terms are all of them have a history which is specifically male-gendered. The history of each of these terms, lynching, Nazism, fascism, posse justice, there was no woman riding out on a horse with a posse in the Wild West to go run down somebody. They were not. These were men with guns. Vigilantism, it's not only male, it is allied with power and it is weaponized. That is the history, that is the context of these terms. And so I think that if we pay some attention to the material reality behind the language that we use, and then we see how it just doesn't add up to apply it to a bunch of women who are too insecure and vulnerable even to give their names. And surely the gap in those two material realities should be able to tell us whether or not we should use certain terms or not. Of course, the minute you start using these terms, you've changed the debate. The minute you start calling these anonymous women fascists, you've changed the debate. We're no longer talking about vulnerable women. We're talking about vulnerable men. So anyway, to say that language matters, and that is why we ask this age-old question. As our friend William Shakespeare will remind us whenever we're in trouble as to what should I think, Shakespeare's a good place to go. What is in a name? And would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? Hence the rose. Here are some of the terms we use for people who have been harassed. We can call them victim, we call them survivors, agents, or a person, or an individual in various ways, and we'll talk about how those are all different. Those are some of the things that we call the people who do the harassment, the perpetrators. Depending on what has happened, you will call them a harasser, an assaulter, or a rapist. And note how those terms are gradated. If someone is just sending you obscene texts, you don't call him a rapist, because we are alive and alert to the nuance of the nature of that harassment, whereas a victim is always a victim, a survivor is always a survivor. So that while we're alive to the nuances and the complexity of what happens, the perpetration, the person to whom it is being done is simply defined all in entirety by that one act. You are simply a victim whether a text has been sent to you or whether you've been raped or anything in the middle has happened to you. Sometimes we're told, well, it was just a bad date or bad sex. Sometimes we say, well, this person is sexist but not racist, they're misogynist, or maybe they're just old-fashioned. And there's this whole array of things, terms that we do and can use to talk about perpetrators and the nature of the perpetration. But when it comes to the person to whom it's done, these are our options. So one way to think about anonymity, or this idea of many women coming together and sharing a document in which they may know each other but nobody else knows them, is to think through trauma studies. I don't know if Kathy Caruth is familiar to a lot of people, but among a lot of very important work, this is one of the things that I carry away with me everywhere. Silence marks the site of trauma. That if silence marks the site of trauma, then it's not even as if trauma has a voice. It's not as if the traumatized has a person or a personhood. Silence marks the site of trauma. And then what do we do? Given that reality, if you come to it from trauma studies, what can we learn about this space? One of them is that if you have the means of breaking the silence in a safe space, and very often the person who's collecting these names is that safe zone. These lists are that safe space. It is a place where you have a community of fellow sufferers, people who recognize what you have gone through, people who help you to give it a name. Very often we know that women, children, men, young boys don't understand what it was that has happened to them until much later when they're able to give it a name. Having a community of people who authenticate your experience and who help you understand it, who help you through a process of catharsis, through sharing, through listening, through simply silently authenticating your experience, to give you a sense of empowerment. And then, to me, the last is the most important. These are solidarities of empathy, where you don't have to know the person. You don't have to know who it was. You don't have to know who they are. You don't have to know where they live, or what they look like. But their experience is something that you empathize with, and this gives a sense of solidarity. There is this whole other way of looking at lists and people who are anonymous, who prefer to remain anonymous, not because they're vindictive or malicious or want to bring down the famous person who's done the harassing, but because they are looking for spaces where they will find solidarities of empathy. So one of the ways in which this works is people with PTSD, soldiers returning from wars, but even other people with other kinds of PTSD, not necessarily simply the one resulting from warfare, where they are victims of a kind but without an identifiable perpetrator. If you're a soldier and you've been to war, who exactly has done this to you? It's hard to name a person or a thing, but you're nevertheless a victim. You're nevertheless suffering from PTSD. There is this thing called the Whisper app, and it allows soldiers or other people to go onto it and simply post about themselves while being anonymous. So this is one of the posts I found there. The worst thing about PTSD is having a breakdown in a cafe on a Monday morning, where people can share small details like that without saying who they are, how they came by their PTSD, anything, simply their own small story that goes into a space where other people understand it. There was this very courageous young woman called Emma Hindman, and when she was in college, she started this thing called the Amplify Project, where these are all quotes from her work. These are not my words. Where she says it's important that stories be told, but it's also important how they are told. There is no right way to be a survivor. It's not as if we must come forward, name ourselves as Christine Fair did, and then name everybody else, and so on. There is no right way. We heal differently. That anonymous writing makes a story both personal and universal at the same time, so that it can be something that you identify with, even if you have no idea who this is. People suffer in different ways. And then I think most importantly for our purposes, protecting privacy does not require silence. Because the backlash seems to be that if you can't name yourself, you should just be quiet. If you're going to speak, give your name and stand up, be accountable, be answerable. Otherwise, you should just not say anything at all. But silence can stigmatize survivors, and it engenders shame and loneliness. And this is how, she says, invisible sexual violence is normalized. It erases the individuals who are affected, and therefore they must carry on, on their own. And so I thought that this was, so her Amplify project was a space on campus where women could write in. It was a journal where women could write in their stories anonymously. They did or did not name their perpetrators, it didn't matter, they simply wrote in their stories. People who wanted to read it, read it. So, another way that I came at this idea of how to break this binary of agent and victim was through a philosopher called Maurice Nathanson, and I don't claim to be a philosopher, so I went looking for explanations, and I found this. And he says that when you put your name out like this, for instance, in a list, the name of your perpetrator, but not your own, then you play a very particular, very unique role. You are anonymous only insofar as you're an anonymous namer. And so you play a very typified role, and we can see that kind of anonymity as being agency. So one way to look at the anonymous person is an agent who is doing one thing. You're committing one act that is relevant to the rest of the world, and that is to name this person who has done something, so that you remain a person somewhere else, you retain your personhood, but you're just bracketing off this part of yourself and saying, this is what I'm doing right now. I'm being anonymous, but I'm naming this person. And so you typify one role, and in that he says you can be seen as an agent. So then the opposite of anonymity is pure agency, or pure is recognition. So that I'm going to come to it in a minute. How do we bring these two things together? The recognition that Me Too demands. This is me, you see my face, you see my name, you see the Me Too, and you recognize immediately who I am and what has happened. The opposite is the anonymous person who is an agent only in one thing, not as a full person, but only as one thing. And then he makes, I think, this very interesting point. He says there's a direct relationship between our ignorance of another person's name and our tendency to perceive that person solely or primarily as an agent, performing a typified role. So the idea really seems to be that when we ask for somebody's name, that name doesn't tell us anything about the person. If I say my name is Giti, it's simply a tag on which you can hang descriptors. Giti is tall. Saying my name is Giti doesn't really tell you anything about myself. It doesn't put my personhood, my selfhood within itself. By knowing my name, you don't suddenly understand who I am and what my life has been or anything really about me. A name is just a tag on which we can hang descriptors. And so what use really is it for women to, or other victims to simply put their names out there? What will it help us do other than add a tag to it, a descriptor, to say, well, this is Melanie. She says that person X has harassed her. We think Melanie is malicious, or whatever it allows you to do. So maybe one way to work our way past this is to figure out where Me Too meets the list. Naming ourselves with the hashtag forces people to recognize us, to say, I was a victim. If it were possible for us to be able to see these people who name themselves and those people who don't name themselves as part of a larger picture, rather than two different kinds of people, rather than two different categories of victims, if we could see them together, to have that shock of recognition that you have when you hear a name and see a face, while you have people whose names you can't see, but you see their experiences and you know why they're doing what they're doing. And to resist this very simple and simplistic division between people who name themselves and people who don't name themselves. If we could do that, then as a feminist practice, we would have a more nuanced, a more complex way of approaching this idea of anonymity. If we could disassociate this idea of personhood from authenticity. Why don't you believe me? Because you don't know my name. It makes no sense. If we could, as feminist practice, just disassociate those two things, it would make approaching these things that are happening around us so much more constructive. We would be able to figure out what to do next. We would be able to figure out how to think about it. I really like this graffiti. I don't know if you can see it, but originally someone has written something rude about the left wing, and over it in blue it says, "Save boys and men from feminism." And then in red, the women have written, "Save women from the likes of you." And I just like this sort of palimpsest, being written over, that the writing on the wall is never permanent. You can rewrite it, you can write over it. The other person that I found very useful in thinking about this idea of agency and victimhood is Soren Reeder. And he has an essay called The Other Side of Agency. And the point that he makes, I think, is really interesting. He says that when we think of ourselves as people, as persons, as individuals, as having a self, the place of agency is so central that a person without agency is only a victim. is not really a full person at all, is forever trapped in this idea of victimhood. And we demand agency, we demand that people are agents in order to be complete people. And in fact, so many of our legal and social and cultural practices are aimed at giving people agency, control over their own lives, actions that can change their situation as it is. And so an agent or a person with agency is a full person, has personhood. A person without agency is a victim and will be only a victim and nothing else. We can never see them as being anything else. They're trapped in their victimhood, and so they're not complete people at all. But Reader says, when I am passive, incapable, constrained, dependent, I am less a person, I count less. And this is the way that we've structured the language and our understanding of people. But he goes on to say that those binaries are not as simple as they might appear. That when we say that personhood assumes agency, we're talking about capability, independence, the ability to make a choice for yourself, and so on. But he says that every kind of agency presupposes what he calls patiency. And he admits that patiency is not a great word to use in this space, because it reminds us of patients who are not really seen as people with a lot of agency. And the image is not a great image to have in your mind. But he also insists that patiency is the philosophical opposite of agency. So, take it or leave it, it doesn't matter. I think the idea is that for every kind of agency that we think that we have, there is the concurrent or the patiency that goes along with it. With every action, there is an inaction. With every kind of capability, there is also an incapability. With every kind of choice or independence, there is necessity and dependency that are implicit in features of agency. And it's a very complicatedly argued out philosophical essay, but this is literally the gist of it. And so the point he makes is that suffering, for instance, is also an act of agency. That when people suffer either an illness or pain or emotional trauma or anything else, that we tend to see suffering as a passive thing. And therefore we call people who suffer victims. And in order not to call them victims, we call them survivors. But they are still defined, whether as survivors or as victims, by that one thing, by that suffering. And so both to be able to see suffering not simply as a passive thing, but also to be able to say that it has agency in it. He says that we should broaden our conception to include potential features, modify our claims about the agential features, have an account of personhood that is more balanced, more realistic, less of a fantasy. Who is a real person? A real person can only be somebody who is active, has choice, capable, control over their lives. Everybody else is not a real person at all. And I think at the root of so much of our conversation, especially around this movement and in feminism, is this idea of who is a victim and who is an agent. Can you be a feminist if you're simply a victim? If you're a real feminist, shouldn't you go out there and fight? Shouldn't you name yourself and be answerable? Otherwise, you're just taking advantage of a system. You're vindictive, you're something else, less a feminist. So, what does this mean for feminism? If we could resist polarizing binaries to say only agency will make you a person, otherwise you're a victim, if we could resist making people agents or victims, named and unnamed, if we could expand our conversations to be more inclusive, less exclusive, less to say we're feminists, this is what we've been doing, you're either with us or you're delegitimizing our causes, whichever side you're coming from, if we can constantly redefine our terms, never to be content with saying, well, this is how we've defined agent, and so this is what agency is, but constantly redefine our terms in the light of experiences and what's happening. To be able to see the face of Me Too and also the anonymity of the list as together, as one picture, and not opposite things that are happening. And then we can reclaim personhood. and not have to say so-and-so is a victim or so-and-so is a survivor. Just as we say for men, oh, this is a man who sent obscene texts, we can say, here's a woman who received obscene texts, rather than saying, here's a victim, here's a survivor, and define people that way. Just to bring other theories and other ways of understanding and learning to our conversation, to create solidarities rather than to create binaries. So I think that's what this means for feminism in general. And this is just some of the people whose voices and ideas I've leaned on in the course of this. Thank you.